Peter Jackson, we effing salute you, sir. Hello YouTube, Film Buff 06 here, coming your way with my review of the recent documentary film They Shall Not Grow Old, which is obviously titled after a slight misquotation from the 1914 Lawrence Binyon poem For the Fallen, which is regularly used in the Ode of Remembrance, enjoyed a simultaneous limited nationwide release, both in 2D and 3D in cinemas, secondary schools, special venues, and the BFI London Film Festival only a couple of months ago, and is actually receiving the same treatment right now in the United States. Was initially broadcast on BBC Two on Remembrance Sunday 2018, was commissioned by both the Imperial War Museum and 14 to 18 Now, which, if you don't know what it is an arts initiative that was set up early this year as part of the official centenary celebrations to mark the end of World War I on Monday, the 11th of November 1918, has a very well-deserved certified fresh score of 98% on Rotten Tomatoes, was co-produced and directed by Sir Peter Jackson, obviously of The Hobbit, King Kong and Lord of the Rings fame, who, by the way, made this documentary as a tribute to his own British-born grandfather, who himself fought in the war, Sergeant William Jackson, was created with the use of over 100 hours of original existing never before seen black and white footage from the extensive archives of the Imperial War Museum, which has also been painstakingly digitally restored, colourised, and post-converted into 3D using the latest in state-of-the-art technology, with the addition of sound effects, Foley artists, special forensic lip reading and voice acting to find out what the soldiers were saying within the footage at that time, alongside archival audio interviews / testimonies with surviving veterans stroke servicemen throughout the decades via both the IWM and the BBC, some of which were actually gleaned from the classic 1964 BBC documentary series The Great War, which itself featured narration from Sir Michael Redgrave, to basically narrate and chronicle the inspirational and epic story of what was known at the time as the war to end all wars, that, as we all obviously know, raged from the 28th of July 1914 to the 11th of November 1918, from the intimate perspectives of their fellow soldiers who valiantly fought and sacrificed their lives on the Western Front for king and country. So, what are my thoughts on They Shall Not Grow Old after seeing it for the first time on the small screen? Now, first of all, to all of my American subscribers out there who have still yet to watch this documentary, I can safely guarantee right now that you guys are not going to be disappointed when you finally do get the chance to watch it. In fact, I could even go as far as to say that this thing had better be nominated by either the Academy or BAFTA next year for Best Documentary Feature, because all I can say about They Shall Not Grow Old, obviously without giving too much away, is that it is incredibly moving, fantastically informative, emotionally powerful, a once-in-a-lifetime immersive experience, if ever there was one, marks yet another extraordinary technical achievement for Sir Peter Jackson and his Wingnut Films and Weta Workshop band of technical wizards in New Zealand, and is thus an absolute bona fide masterpiece, not just of documentary filmmaking, but of 21st century filmmaking so far in general. And this is coming from someone who was not only introduced to World War I through history classes and reading Private Peaceful during my school years, as well as through watching some random history documentaries on the subject on YouTube and or elsewhere. One or two of the World War I set episodes of Blackadder, the 1979 TV movie remake of All Quiet on the Western Front, My Boy Jack and Warhorse, but I'd also been dying to see how this documentary was going to turn out, especially ever since I checked out the trailer and heard the fantastic word of mouth stroke buzz surrounding it. What Peter Jackson and his team did with this extraordinary mass of 100-year-old black and white World War I footage by literally digitally restoring and colorizing it, a process which, by the way, up to this point had otherwise been initially perceived as rather controversial, gimmicky, and a cash grab, especially due to it having already been done horrendously in the past two other films that are otherwise so much better filmed in black and white, such as Scrooge 1951, Casablanca, and especially It's a Wonderful Life, in a way that feels fresh, original, and innovative, makes you feel like you're stepping into a dream that eventually turns into a nightmare, or like you're watching a century-old painting come to life in front of your eyes, has never ever been seen or done before in any other wartime documentary, and is perfectly accessible not just to historians and scholars, but to pretty much everybody. Plus slowing the speed down from 13 to 18 frames per second to the regular 24 frames per second that we're normally accustomed to nowadays. Not only to make all the soldiers that were involved in the war look and feel like real, living, breathing human beings like you and I, as opposed to a bunch of animated Charlie Chaplin-esque stick figures, but also to make it all look as if it was filmed just yesterday on a smartphone, as opposed to 1914 to 18, is an absolutely unique, brilliant, masterful, and amazing technical feat in every sense of the word. And speaking of which, the moment 25 minutes into the documentary in which the transformation of the footage happens from letterboxed black and white to full widescreen colour, which, by the way, I wouldn't exactly be too surprised if they took inspiration to execute this moment as brilliantly as they did from the iconic shot in The Wizard of Oz where Dorothy opens the sepia door and steps into the vivid Technicolor world of Oz, was so breathtaking. It literally made my jaw drop in amazement. And it even made some of the more graphic and gory imagery of blood, dead horses, flies and rats feasting on some of the corpses, horrifically mangled limbs of soldiers on barbed wire within no man's land, rotted human flesh from the effects of trench foot and or gangrene, and even soldiers being gunned down by enemy fire, shell-shocked ripped and or literally blown to pieces on the battlefield, all the more gruesome, disturbing, and actually downright shocking to watch, because it all felt just that intensely real. Plus, you can clearly tell how much of a true passion project and a real personal labour of love this was for Jackson. How almost obsessed he was with the First World War, and specifically with doing justice to the human scale and tragedy of the war, ever since reading up on the Gallipoli War and being told stories as a kid by his dad of what his grandfather did during the war. How much of a major influence certain aspects of the war were to him when it came to how he shot the visually fantastic and mind-blowing battle scenes in Lord of the Rings, even especially the Battle of Helm's Deep towards the end of the Two Towers, as well as how much this was the return to true form he desperately needed after he took a bit of an extended break from directing blockbusters, especially due to the physically exhausting, time-consuming, and unfortunately quite miserable time he felt he had with directing the Hobbit trilogy. The soundtrack is just incredibly detailed and flows seamlessly with both the narration from the soldiers themselves and the voice dubbing, not just to make up for the complete lack of an epic instrumental score in this documentary, but to actually make you feel like you've virtually gone back in time to 1914 to 18, and thus are in the heart of the action yourself on the front line with these soldiers during some of the most hellish and darkest days of this terrible, needless war that ultimately, as we all know, sowed the seeds of the even bloodier Second World War just a couple of decades later. Very, very similarly in a way to both versions of All Quiet on the Western Front. I also loved how daring, ballsy and unafraid this documentary was to show and not just tell us how stark, harsh, horrific, brutal, unromanticized and ultimately futile war truly is, especially when you take into consideration the fact that the scale of the First World War up to this point has almost otherwise been completely forgotten about and dwarfed for obvious reasons by that of the Second World War, which, by the way, in comparison to the First World War, had a much more perfectly justified, necessary, and legit reason to happen, not just because there were higher global stakes involved, but also because there was a much clearer and greater threat that we knew had to be ultimately fought and destroyed once and for all, in the shape of far-right fascism in Western Europe, and particularly that of Hitler and the Nazis, obviously due to the many horrific atrocities they were inflicting upon the Jews during the Holocaust around that particular time. Plus, literally nobody at the time, not even the politicians and or the soldiers themselves, really knew what they were fighting for, why they had to fight, other than to preserve the future of the British Empire, who they were supposed to be fighting, ultimately didn't care which side was going to win. And at the end of the day, it just treated these poor men as if they were nothing, instead of war heroes when they came back home after the war had ended in 1918, and just didn't want to speak about, express interest in, acknowledge and or understand what happened during the war and the extreme horrors these men had to go through in the trenches for 4 horrendous years. My only initial gripe with this documentary on first viewing was with the inclusion of the song Mademoiselle from Armentières at the end. Not just because I felt it was a bit overlong and repetitive, but because it was a song that I honestly wasn't too familiar with at first. But after recently stumbling on a random YouTube video of the clip and listening to the song again, it really started to grow on me and become a bit, catchy, and it gave me a much more complete understanding of what Jackson was trying to do with his inclusion of the song, not just because it was particularly popular during the war years, but because he wanted to audibly show to us the innocence, the hopefulness, the confidence, the pragmatism, and just really the optimism that these soldiers must have felt at the time, even when you consider the fact that they didn't quite fully understand the seriousness of what they were marching themselves into, and obviously had no idea that they were essentially sent to the meat grinder by their own governments / monarchies for basically what turned out to be zero reason to begin with. In conclusion, I absolutely adored They Shall Not Grow Old. It was made at exactly the pitch perfect time. It never failed to emotionally move me, keep me glued to the screen throughout its 100-minute runtime, and thus leave me on the edge of my seat. It made me feel like I was there in the trenches with these soldiers. it delved into and put under the microscope the intimate, personal and human aspect of what was essentially an inhuman, politically charged and senseless war born out of pure imperialism, capitalism, the assassination of an Austro-Hungarian archduke and his wife, and essentially a massive family feud between the royal houses of Europe, and at the same time wasn't afraid not just to visually show the more graphic, gruesome, disturbing, violent, horrible, and undeniably ugly side of that war without politicizing it too much, but also to show the humour and sense of camaraderie that these soldiers shared amongst themselves in the trenches, especially during an extraordinarily stressful time, in a way that I feel most Hollywood war movies nowadays have somewhat, in a way, irresponsibly censored, glossed over, and or sanitized to a certain extent. It allowed us to see history a little bit differently from what we've been taught in history classes, as well as relate and get to know a little bit more all of the soldiers, some of whom were our grandfathers and or great-grandfathers, who weren't just giving up their lives on the front line to protect all of us as well as their own country, who didn't just treat the process of training, preparation and going to war as if it was a great adventure they were going to embark on, or a special extended Boy Scouts or men's holiday camp with a little sense of danger, or a job that they felt a sense of duty and purpose to do, regardless of the emotional outcome, but who also laughed, smiled, clowned around amongst each other, terribly lacked proper dental hygiene, often had to go to the loo seated on a bench with their bottoms sticking out, playfully mugged towards the cameras, and surprisingly made friendships with supposed enemies. Even the Germans themselves, believe it or not. It brilliantly achieved what it set out to do, which was to tell a straightforward point A to point B narrative without it ever feeling like it's going on a random tangent or feeling a bit inconsistent or messy and or all over the place, as well as pay tribute and apt attention to such an extraordinary period of modern history that should and will never ever be forgotten for future generations to come. It shall send an especially important warning to all the politicians out there to never ever repeat the mistakes of the past for their own selfish interests, to never allow a war of this scale to ever happen again, and to never ever turn a blind eye and take the lives of those who fight and die to protect their country and loved ones for granted. It is destined to be the textbook definition of essential, mandatory, must-see viewing for secondary schools, colleges and universities throughout this country and around the world for future generations to come. It has the potential to pave the way for more black and white footage to receive a similar treatment to this. It easily ranks right up there with the likes of Heavenly Creatures, King Kong and Lord of the Rings as one of Peter Jackson's finest works to date, and is hands down not just one of the best documentary films ever made, but also one of, if not the best and most important documentary I have ever seen this year, period. I cannot freaking highly recommend enough that you not only go and check out the Great War documentary series, but also go and check this documentary out, either in the States or on DVD and Blu-ray right now, if you're into the history of World War I, if you have distant relatives who served, fought, and or died in the war, if you're a fan of wartime documentaries, or if you're a fan of Peter Jackson's works in general. I freaking cannot wait to get this documentary on DVD this Christmas and personally cherish it forever, so that when I hopefully have children and grandchildren of my own in the future, I will gladly show it to them so that they can have a better understanding of what the experience of the Great War was like. And with all of that being said, I honestly cannot be any happier and prouder enough to give They Shall Not Grow Old the overall awesome-tacular and perfect rating it truly deserves, which is a 10 out of 10. Now, please feel free to leave a comment in the section below, and please let me know your thoughts on They Shall Not Grow Old. And also let me know if you had any distant relations of your own that served in the war and what experiences they went through. Plus, feel free to subscribe to my channel as always, as well as go to my channel page and click on the little bell so that you get all of the notifications and updates from my channel via email. And also, if you haven't already, please don't forget to join my Facebook group page, as well as follow me on Twitter and Instagram. And until my next video, which is going to be my review of the criminally underrated 1998 Sam Raimi thriller classic a simple plan. Do take care, everyone, and lest we forget.